Welcome to Snow College Convocation this week. We're delighted to welcome Dr. Sumiko Martinez to the stage. I'd like to give you a little bit of an introduction. Sumiko Martinez is passionate about advocating for underrepresented populations and engaging communities to effect meaningful changes. After earning a BA in English from Westminster College and a master's degree and PhD in communication from the University of Utah, her resolute belief in the value of humanity and the innate power in each of us has led her to pursue a career in assisting others. She worked in higher education for 15 years and partnered with K-12 educators across Utah, served as chair of the Board of Utah Humanities, and most recently joined the Madison House Autism Foundation as the director of the Autism After 21 Utah Blueprint Initiative, an ambitious endeavor to improve the opportunities and lives of the neurodiverse adult population in Utah. Sumiko has been a speaker and invited lecturer at conferences, fundraisers, and events, including acting as emcee for TEDxSaltLakeCity. And she was awarded the Utah Women in Higher Education Network's Special Recognition Award for her work on emergency student financial aid in 2020. She lives in West Valley City with her husband, Sean, their hilarious twin daughters, and their motorcycles, Ginger and Lenore. Please welcome to the stage, Dr. Martinez.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Dr. Bodrero. It is a pleasure to be with you here today. Half of my family has gone to Snow College, so it's nice to be here in Ephraim, not just because of the glorious drive on the way down, but to be here with the Badgers. So thank you for having me. I hope you guys are having a good semester so far and that you're not eating too many ramen noodles. Oh, ramen noodle recognition. There was a stretch of my undergrad where I was so broke that for 3 solid weeks I only ate ramen noodles, and that much sodium is not good for you. So learn from my mistakes, eat a vegetable. So now to our topic at hand. The first and probably most important thing for me to say today is that I am not the expert on autism, because no one truly is. We have a lot of incredible people working hard on autism to understand this better. Researchers, family members, autists themselves, but there's still so much to learn and discover. And so I want to just kick this off by saying this is a journey of discovery for me. I'm learning more and more every day, and I invite you to come along this part of it with me. So here is a quick overview of what we're going to talk about in this presentation. Key terms and definitions, brief history of autism. We've got some interactive quizzes, so you'll have an excuse to get your phone out. A little bit on language and why it's so important, and then an invitation to action. I'll tell you more about the Autism After 21 Utah project, and then we'll have time for a Q&A session at the end. So before we really jump in, let's get over our key terms and definitions, shall we? As I mentioned, we will have the Q&A, so if you hear me use a term that you're not familiar with in this presentation, just jot it down and ask about it at the end. I would be happy to take a whack at defining anything, or to tell you that I will go look up a definition with you. Just kidding, sorry, skipped a slide there. So the first term I want to define is neurodiverse. Is this something you guys have heard about before? Couple of nods, good. I just found out that you guys have a program called Badgers Belong that's all about encouraging diversity and providing support for that on campus, so this is kind of a cool synchronicity thing. So neurodiversity is the idea that there can be a lot of variation in the human brain. It is a value-neutral way to talk about those variations, and that better allows us to recognize the strengths of certain developmental disorders. So a neurodiverse brain might be a brain with autism or ADHD or dyspraxia or other variations. Neurotypical is a brain that is not affected by a developmental disorder. It conforms to a more sort of common developmental trajectory. Autism or autism spectrum disorder, this is probably a word that most of you have at least heard before. Autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder. So the major characteristics of autism that have been identified thus far are difficulties with social relationships, communication struggles, repetitive behaviors, and sensory hyper or hyposensitivities. The best diagnostic tests for autism are currently designed for children, but more tools are becoming available for adults. And as those tools become available and more widely practiced, we're seeing an influx of adult diagnoses that were missed by the standard tests in early childhood. An intellectual or developmental disability, or IDD, according to the National Institutes of Health, IDDs are disorders that are usually present at birth and uniquely affect the trajectory of an individual's physical, intellectual, or emotional development. Many of these conditions affect multiple body parts or systems. Some examples of IDDs, along with autism, are cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, and Fragile X syndrome. All right, and then prevalence rate is essentially a statistical measure that will tell us how many of a given number of people in a certain period of time experience a certain condition. So that's pretty much the most vague definition you could ever hear. But as we go through the presentation, I'll use it in a real sentence, and it will hopefully make more sense. Okay, a brief timeline of autism. Hopefully you guys can see the screen okay. I know there are extra screens over there, but I'm not going to expect you to read this whole thing, don't worry. So this is just a quick highlight reel of the past 110 years of autism research and work. In 1911, a Swiss psychiatrist named Eugen Bleuler coined the term autism to describe what he believed was the childhood version of schizophrenia. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, psychologists continued to employ a case-based mode of research where they would get a small group of people who shared common symptoms and behaviors and describe them in great detail. If you ever have trouble getting to sleep, you can read some of those early case studies. When I say great detail, I am not joking. Throughout the early half of the 20th century, autism came to be better known and was eventually recognized as something separate from schizophrenia. But the prevalent understanding was that somebody with autism was locked inside their own head. In 1943, an American child psychiatrist named Leo Kanner published a study of 11 children called Autistic Disturbances of Affective Contact, which contained a description of something he called infantile autism as a distinct condition rather than as characteristic of schizophrenia or other disorders. In 1944, Austrian scientist Hans Asperger published a study titled Autistic Psychopathy in Childhood, which was a similar description of the behavior of several boys. At this point, autism was thought to be a mental illness rather than a neurodevelopmental disorder. In 1949, Kanner threw a pretty big wrench in the works when he published an article blaming unloving parents, especially cold and formal mothers, for their children's autism. This caused quite a bit of harm to families, to people with autism, and sent autism research sort of down a rabbit hole for a while before that theory was debunked. In the 1950s, the first DSM, or Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, was published. This was a groundbreaking step because it provided a standard classification system for mental disorders. Previously, there had not been any sort of huge, rigorous publication. This is something that continues to this day and is updated periodically. It's also, if anybody needs a good research paper topic, the source of a great deal of controversy, because the things that end up in the DSM have a profound influence on clinical practice and people's lived experiences. In 1956, an American psychiatrist named Leon Eisenberg also published a study involving 63 participants, which was the start of a big change in how autism research was conducted. Rather than relying on thick descriptions of relatively few people, this was the start of a shift to a more epidemiological model of research that examined issues across broader groups of people and would ultimately help lead to today's population-level studies conducted with the CDC. In the 60s, true to form, there was a sea change in attitudes about autism. The parent advocate movement picked up steam as parents fought to secure humane living conditions and treatments for their children. Additionally, Norwegian-American clinical psychologist Ole Lovas began developing the pioneering applied behavior analysis, or ABA therapy, And this is a treatment that continues to be refined and used to this day, and is a highly effective option for many people with autism. In the 1970s, British psychiatrist Lorna Wing developed the concept of an autism spectrum with 3 affected areas: social interaction, communication, and imagination. She was the mother of a child with severe autism, and her concept, the triad of impairment, forms the basis for the way that we understand autism today as a heterogeneous spectrum. Additionally, in 1977, there was the first study on twins and autism. Researchers had long thought that there might be a genetic component, but this study confirmed that there is indeed a genetic role played in the roots of autism. In the 1980s, the disability rights movement was in full swing, as people with disabilities insisted on equal access and treatment under the law. This would eventually lead to the shutdown of institutions that had been abusing disabled and mentally ill patients, such as Willowbrook in New York State. Also a good topic for a term paper if anybody's looking for subjects. Additionally, if you want to see a good movie about this movement, check out Crip Camp on Netflix. It is a very good documentary. The DSM-3 was published in the 1980s, and that included diagnostic criteria for infantile autism for the first time. At this point, autism was still largely thought of as a pediatric issue. In the 1990s, autism was included as a disability category under the Federal Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This sounds boring, but was actually a really big step because it allowed students with autism to get accommodations and support that they needed to be able to learn and flourish in public schools. During the 2000s, the autistic self-advocate movement started to really take off, with organizations like the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network formed to help represent autistic voices in the national dialogue. Their motto is "Nothing about us without us." Self-advocacy continues to this day to be a very important facet of autism work. In 2013, the DSM-5 combined 4 previous diagnoses: autistic disorder, Asperger's syndrome, the very catchily named pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, and childhood disintegrative disorder under the single heading of autism spectrum disorder. Proponents argued that all 4 of the independent diagnoses shared the same symptoms but differed in severity, which they thought merited a change. That's actually one of the controversies surrounding the DSM, if you are interested in delving into that world. And now here we are in the 2020s. There has been so much accomplished in the past 110 years, but the issues facing people with autism are certainly not all solved. Many states in the US have long wait lists before people can get federal assistance to access the support services they need. For example, there are more than 4,000 people in Utah on the wait list right now. Federally mandated services for people with autism typically end at 21. This means that adults with autism are essentially on their own to navigate and secure the support that works for them. The cost of autism can also be very high. Oftentimes, a parent or caregiver has to leave the workforce to provide full-time care to a child with autism. Homelessness is also a serious problem for adults with autism. Many people find themselves out on the streets later in life after a loved one that they were living with passes away or becomes incapacitated. It's estimated that approximately 30% of the people experiencing homelessness at any given time have an IDD. However, there are many organizations and researchers here in Utah working to help with these issues, including Madison House with the AA21 Utah Project. So one of the important lessons that we can take from that very, very brief history of science is that it's continually changing. This obviously makes it a bit complicated for things like, say, dealing with an ongoing pandemic when the most accurate knowledge is constantly being updated, or making decisions about treatment options for a neurodevelopmental disorder like autism. But I really like this quote from Margaret. She was the participant in a research study that investigated what autistic people thought about stereotypes of autism. And I think it calls us to bring with us an open mind and our critical thinking skills and pull those more into the forefront of our lives, not to get stuck on things that have been disproved, and to really acknowledge and see the humanity in each other rather than the labels that get stuck onto us. Okay, now that you've had a whirlwind background, let's get out your cell phones. Time for a quiz. All right, so you're going to want to text the code Sumiko Martinez 873 to the number 22333. And then this is just a regular cell phone style quiz where you type in the number, or the letter, rather, of the answer you think is correct. Oops, let's see, hang on. Activate. There we go. Oh, dang it, my screen mirroring is not working. I mean, is it really a presentation until you have technical difficulties? Hold on just a second. There we go. Okay. And if the Wi-Fi crashes right now, that's going to be kind of funny. Ha, good. Okay. So, everybody got their phones out? That was like the quietest phone accessing I think I've ever witnessed. Either that or you all already had your phones out under the chairs. So, if you need the code, again, it's right up there. It's just text Sumiko Martinez 873 to 22333. And then once you have that done, wave your phone in the air. Pretend we're at a concert. Thank you. Excellent. Look at all those lights. I'm not going to attempt any rock star moves, although my twins do this funny thing where they'll like run across and then like slide on their knees. And we got answers coming in. Excellent. All right. So for each question, I've got 10 questions for this quiz. For each question, I'll give about a minute for people to read and respond. This first one is, autism is a spectrum disorder, which means that everyone experiences differently, or pretty much the same set of symptoms for everybody. Go ahead and get your votes in. What I should have done is queued up the Jeopardy music, which is probably copyrighted. Who's whistling? That's magnificent. Thank you. Awesome. All right, either you're all completely perfect and on the ball, or only one person has answered, but I actually can't tell what it is from this screen. So I'm going to assume that you all got the right answer. That is A, autism is a spectrum disorder. There's a saying in the autism community that if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. Every person has their own unique combination of traits. All right, the next question. Get out your cell phones. Autism may be caused by genetic factors, environmental factors, or both genetic and environmental factors. Oh, this is kind of fun. Now we're getting percents. This is fun. Let's see. It's a little bit like watching a horse race, you know, like who's edging ahead, which answer is going to prevail. B is kind of undecided there. That's sort of funny. All right, it looks like we're leveling out. Get in your last votes, place your bets. Okay, and the answer is C, both genetic and environmental factors. The truth is that the exact causes of autism are not currently known, but there is a lot of research being done to determine what those causal factors are. For example, the SPARK study from the Simons Foundation is recruiting tens of thousands of families to participate in a massive genetic study to learn specifically what genes are associated with autism so that appropriate treatments can be developed to help improve people's quality of life. So far, they have isolated over 150 genes and chromosome segments that are related to autism. It's actually published online if you want to go look up the list. Okay. What percentage of adults in Utah are estimated to have autism? 2.28%, 3%, 1.75%, 1%, or none of the above. And I know questions like this are sort of mean because it's basically just making you guess at this point. But don't worry, you will not be graded on this. The answers to this are all anonymous. Bless you. All right, looks like answers might be leveling out a little bit. B's pulling up close to A here. Okay, and the answer is, drum roll, 2.28%. This puts Utah slightly above the national average prevalence rate of 2.21%. And that prevalence rate, again, is the proportion of individuals in a given population at a certain time period with a certain attribute. So in this case, in 2020, the CDC released their first estimated numbers of adults with autism, and these were the 2.28 was Utah's prevalence rate. While most people do think of autism that is something that impacts children, it is indeed a lifelong condition. And it's kind of wild that it took until 2020 to get those numbers out. All right, next question is, autistic individuals often have a heightened sensitivity to sound, touch, light, crowds, or all of the above. Oh, there we go. Somebody answered C. I feel like somebody answered C just because you felt bad for me standing up here not knowing if everybody had got their answers in. Which I will take it. I will take a pity answer. And A. All right. So the conventional answer is E, all of the above. Although, as mentioned previously, everybody experiences different symptoms, so it might be entirely possible for somebody to be more sensitive to one sensory input than others. Let's do a quick awareness activity right now. So go ahead and look around this room. Think about the lighting. What color is it? Is it flickering or steady? Are you getting a weird glare off of anything? I do have very shiny glasses on, Hopefully that's not blinding anybody. Are the lights natural, fluorescent, dimmed? Do you see different qualities and characteristics of light? Now think about the sound. What noises do you hear in the background? Are the lights making a weird hum, or the projector? Are the sounds muted? Do you hear shoes scuffing on the ground? Or chairs creaking? This is a pretty new auditorium, so I'm guessing the chairs are probably not an issue. Is someone clicking a pen? Or breathing heavily? Now imagine that you are hyper aware of every one of these sensory inputs all the time. How much more difficult would it be to have a conversation with somebody if all of those things are crowded to the forefront of your mind while you're trying to talk? How much harder would it be to tune out those sensory inputs? That's an example of, a sort of put yourself in the shoes of what it might be like to be hypersensitive. Oh, buddy. So just an example of something that a lot of people with autism do have to contend with on a daily basis. All right, the next question. One common characteristic of autism spectrum disorder is repetitive behaviors or spontaneous outbursts of laughter. You guys ever have that experience where you're like listening to an audiobook or something like that on your headphones and it comes across a funny passage and you just like snort in the middle of a grocery store or something? That happens to me occasionally. All right, it looks like most answers are in. The correct answer for this one is repetitive behaviors. Physical repetitive behaviors are sometimes called stimming, which is short for self-stimulating behaviors that a person can use to calm themselves and feel more regulated. And it's actually, if you think about it, physical movements to help yourself feel calm are a super common human characteristic in general. So think about what it is that you do when you're nervous. I'm a pen clicker. I'm a lifelong, obnoxious pen clicker. And then I'll also spin my rings around my fingers when I'm nervous. So if you think about that, it's actually a really common human characteristic. And one of the things that you can do is to help normalize that, when I was younger, I worked with a woman who would knit during meetings. And at the time, being young and full of what I thought were all the right answers in life, I was always like, oh my gosh, this lady is not paying attention to anything ever. She's just knitting away. Turns out, she actually had autism, and knitting was a way for her to keep her hands busy so she could focus her brain on the meeting at hand. So that was kind of a good learning experience for me, to not judge other people's regulatory behaviors. All right, let's go to the next question. This is, only boys are diagnosed with autism, true or false? I would like to congratulate you on being more informed than the general public. Good job, everybody. This is actually still a common myth about autism. There are indeed girls and women who are diagnosed with autism. The prevalence rate is 3.62 for males in the US, and that is higher than the prevalence rate of 0.86% for females. We don't know what exactly that discrepancy is caused by. There is, as with everything else, research ongoing into what those causes are. It may be an actual cause. It may be that our diagnostic tools are not accurately measuring things correctly. So, another fun area of continued learning. Okay, another one. People with autism are usually savants and geniuses. True, false, or it varies? Okay, it looks like we've leveled out just about, 99% there. And the correct answer is indeed C. It varies, just like with neurotypical people. But this is a common media portrayal. If you think about TV shows or movies that have somebody with autism, a lot of the time they are portrayed as socially awkward geniuses. And while estimates are about 10% of people with autism have a genius IQ, that's not necessarily a generalizable fact, and it can create some difficulties. It's a popular misconception that can lead the general public to have unrealistic expectations about how a person with autism might behave. So it's a good reminder for us to approach people as individuals rather than with stereotypes, which is funny because this is something we've all been hearing since before kindergarten, and yet one of those things that we human critters are not the best at. Okay, people with autism are blank times more likely than the general population to develop seizure disorders. This is an exciting one. 4 choices is apparently the right number of choices for a good. Still some movement there. Okay, it looks like we're starting to level out. All right, and the correct answer in this case is 10 times. So as a neurodevelopmental disorder, autism is often accompanied by other medical diagnoses, meaning that people with autism frequently have to contend with medically complex situations. There may be a genetic link between autism and epilepsy, and several specific genes have been identified that are present for both disorders, but it's, again, not known exactly why this happens. So ongoing discovery. That's the theme of today's talk, is if you don't know, keep researching. Okay, next one. Autistic people do not make eye contact. True or false? It looks like we're leveling out again. So the correct answer to this one is false. There are indeed some people with autism who are uncomfortable with eye contact, just like some neurotypical people are uncomfortable with eye contact. People with autism are more likely to avoid eye contact, and some researchers think this may be a combination of an indifference to eye contact that eventually leads to a learned behavior over the course of a lifetime. All right, and then the last piece of the quiz. People with autism can have satisfying, productive, and happy lives. This is a leading question, guys. This is a prime case of what not to do if you're doing a genuine survey. Because the answer is obviously true. Of course, people with autism can have satisfying, productive, and happy lives. Autistic people may have different support needs, but that does not mean that it is not possible to have a good life. Many people with autism can and do have relationships, jobs, families, hobbies, and more. Indeed, people who have or are thought to have had autism have made some of the most significant contributions to art, science, technology, and music. And it is on us as a society to work alongside autistic self-advocates and their families to make sure that every person has access to the resources and support they need to live life to the fullest. All right, so that's it for the quiz. Let's see if I can correctly switch back to the PowerPoint. Thank you for quizzing along with me there. Oh, dang it, started at the beginning, sorry. Here we go. Okay, so by training, I am a communication scholar. And you know how when you get a new tool or you have like a favorite tool, then everything needs to have that tool applied for it. That's how it is with me in communication. Everything for me is always infused in the various ways that we humans try to understand and make ourselves known to each other. So this section, I'm going to talk a little bit more about language. Communication is an integral part of the way that we organize and understand ourselves. And because of this, language can be a powerful tool. It can be used to marginalize and oppress. It can be used to liberate and connect. And because we are imperfect beings working with an imperfect medium, language often does both of those things at the same time in different ways. It both liberates and oppresses, marginalizes and connects. Communication is, in many ways, the medium in which we are all immersed. Sometimes we're so immersed in it that we do not even notice we're constantly swimming through this sea. But once you do notice it, you will start to see it operating all the time. The idea that many aspects of the world are created and sustained by and through communication is called social constructionism. So one good example of this is autism itself. The roots of the word autism that we know today can be traced through the early 20th century German Autismus to the ancient Greek root autos, which is the combinant form of self. More specifically, this form of self refers to human activity or behavior with the sense of or relating to oneself. So recall from the history section of this talk, the earliest modern uses of autismus and autism were from Bleuler's cases dealing with schizophrenia. So in 1911, when Bleuler coined that term, autism meant some of the symptoms of schizophrenia and was thought to be a total self-involvement. Over the course of the last century, as we learned more and gained more understanding, refined our definitions, wrote, talked, shared information, the actual meaning of autism changed. It went through iterations and phases, not necessarily in a linear here to there trajectory. but it was constantly in flux. At each particular moment in time, an understanding of what it means to be autistic was filtered through the language of psychology and medicine, through diagnoses and criteria lists in DSMs, through genetics and federal policy, through interpersonal conversations and school systems. I would imagine that as we continue through our current century, we will continue to see this happen. That example of how a social understanding of a certain condition is mediated through language and what is known and shared about the condition, that's a real-life example of social constructionism. And this is actually a theory that I find incredibly hopeful, because to me, it means that we really do have a chance to make a difference and to change things for the better. The social world, where we experience many of the joys and pains of human relationships and existence, it's not a fixed entity. It is something that we can collectively improve and make kinder and more compassionate through our everyday choices. Now, if that seems like kind of a heavy lift for words, I understand. The first time I heard about this, I was like, what? But, hear me out. Communication does seem like sort of an ephemeral thing, but I'm going to suggest a few concrete actions to try out in your actual real life, some experiments that you can put into play in your everyday interactions, and then you can judge for yourselves. The first suggestion is to identify people the way they prefer to be identified. For example, my name is Sumiko, and I do not like it when people give me nicknames. I prefer to be called Sumiko, and I appreciate it when people take the time to learn how to pronounce it correctly and then use my name correctly, because it makes me feel seen and respected. Now, to take that same basic principle and apply it to the world of autism, there's an idea of identity first or people first language. Identity first language is where the group attribution is the primary focus. So that would be an autistic person. People first language is language where the focus is on the person rather than the condition, a person with autism. So which one is correct? That's the catch. They are both correct. And it is up to the person who has autism or the autistic person to decide how they want to be referred to. You could simply ask if somebody prefers identity first or people first language, and then remember and respect their preference. If you make this adjustment in your communication practices, you might be surprised at how far this can ripple out. Your family and friends might notice that you are using a different communication pattern. They might ask you why you're doing that, and then you have a chance to tell them what you learned here at Convocation today about identity first and people first language, and give them a chance to modify their communication practices and so on. The second thing to try out is being aware of the value attribution of language. And this is also something that probably seems kind of like a no-brainer until you catch yourself doing it all the time. Modern American English is loaded with the tendency towards dyads, pairs of opposing things. Up and down, backwards and forwards, light and dark, right and wrong. This is one of those instances where language reinforces certain ways of thinking, and certain ways of thinking reinforce language. Notice that in each of those pairs, if you were to apply them in a conversation, one would almost always be preferable to the other. It can vary by context, but in other words, the pairs have value judgments attached. Forward thinking is better than backward thinking. Right is better than wrong. So what to do about this? One simple thing you can do is start thinking and talking about things in groups of more than two. Give you a list of 3. This can be a surprisingly disruptive way to add more nuance to your communication and can lead you to think in a more open-ended way. Let me give you an example that's relevant to autism. You may have heard of people saying things like high functioning and low functioning when they talk about a person with autism. But if you think about that, that carries a pretty clear connotation of value judgment. It's pretty clear that in that instance, high functioning is supposed to be better than low functioning. It's also not a very accurate way to describe the incredible diversity and specificity experienced by people with autism. So one way to complicate your language could be to describe more specifically the support needs rather than the degree to which you assume that person functions. Even the concept of high, medium, and low support needs carries a different value valence than simply high and low. The third thing I'm going to suggest is also the hardest thing, because it's less about changing your everyday language and more about trying out a different perspective. This is a quote from one of my favorite philosophers, Alain Badiou. It's from a rather marvelous conversation turned into a very short book called In Praise of Love. And in this conversation, Badiou lays out a philosophy of love that is active, existential, and dynamic, shaped by the strength of our moment-to-moment choices. When he says that love is an existential project to construct a world from a decentered point of view other than that of my mere impulse to survive or reaffirm my own identity, he is calling on us to practice love through unselfishness. So this might not seem like something you can walk out of this auditorium and just start to do, but I actually think it might be. Every single interaction you have with somebody is full of tiny choices. Some of them might be so routine to you that you don't even realize it. Things like how close you stand to somebody, how much eye contact you make, the volume of your speaking voice. These things may be all automatic to you, but they communicate just as much as your words do. I think that one way we can practice love through communication is by attending to those tiny choices, being aware of what we are choosing to do in our interactions, and simply considering the other person. So let me give you a real-life example. My best friend from high school has had chronic migraines for as long as I've known her, just brutal, debilitating migraines. So when I'm talking with her, there are a few practices that I deliberately engage in to demonstrate my compassion and love for her. I validate and empathize with her experience by calling her problem migraine instead of headache. I don't trivialize her problem and say like, oh, you should just take an aspirin. I ask her if I'm speaking too loudly, do a little volume check. I tend to get very animated and obnoxiously loud sometimes. So I always ask her like, please tell me if I'm being too loud. I always do a lighting check for some place that the lights are bothering her. If there's a flicker, if it's too bright, if there's a glare, then I'll offer, let's go somewhere else and we can keep talking. So these are little tiny choices, but every time I attend to one of those choices in conversation with my friend, I am communicating to her that I care about her experience. I love her. I do not want her to suffer. So those are my challenges to you. Use the communication practices of identifying people how they want to be identified, disrupting the typical value attribution labels that we habitually use, and find opportunities to communicate love through your everyday choices and language. Put together, I think these are actually 3 very powerful tools for changing the world, one little bit at a time. So we've talked a little bit about things we can do as individuals. Now, what can Utah do to improve living conditions for people with autism? I'm going to tell you a little bit about the AA21 Utah project, which is the collective impact project that I'm running with Madison House Autism Foundation. So we are conducting research to learn more about what makes neuro-inclusive communities. What we want to know is how autism-friendly are Utah's communities and what can we do to make them better. So this project, we're in the research phase right now, and this is actually a really exciting thing for me because the thing I love about research is you don't know what you're going to get. It's the box of chocolates on a nerd scale. So we are in phase 1 of this project. We're beginning our research. Once that research has concluded, we're going to be reaching into all 29 counties of the state, working with communities, working at the local level to try and get a demographically representative selection of research participants to join us in this project. And then that baseline data on how autism-friendly are Utah's communities and what can we do to improve it will help us to then go into the next phase, which is pulling together cross-sector partnerships. A lot of the things that people face these days are too big and intractable to be solved by a single entity. And so bringing people together from different backgrounds, different expertise, that's going to give us a strong platform to actually start to implement some innovative solutions. The third phase is putting it all together and making the model available for anybody else who wants to use it in their local communities. So this is going to be a pretty exciting project. Utah is uniquely situated to take on a project like this. This is a pilot, it's the first in the nation. Our communities range from urban to rural, suburban to extremely remote, with an equally wide range of available services. We have strong family values in this state and an entrepreneurial spirit, and I think this is going to be a pretty amazing project that unfolds over the next few years. So I invite each and every one of you to join us in this effort of creating new knowledge, forging unexpected partnerships, and implementing new and innovative solutions. If you're interested in getting involved, please reach out to me. This is not an empty thing. I'm going to put my email up in a minute, and I'd love to hear from any of you. Put simply, here's what Utah can do. We can care that each adult with autism has their needs met, and then we can take action through our communication, through our choices, through our influences, to make sure that it actually happens. Ultimately, all of us together shape the world into what it is. Let's make our choices wisely. All right, that's it for my prepared remarks. Thank you for letting me share some thoughts with you guys today. I hope this has been useful for you. My contact information is up here. And if you'd like a copy of the slide deck or the bibliography for this presentation, send me an email and I'd be happy to share that with you. And now I think it's Q&A time. So what sort of questions do you have? Let's see, one right there.
My brother is autistic. How would I be able to help him with his autism, and how will I be able to help him get the resources he needs?
That's a great question. So I did mention at the beginning that I am not the expert in autism. I will answer all the questions as best I can. That's my disclaimer. And if I don't know how to answer a question, I will just tell you guys that I don't know the answer. So in this case, I would say that the best people to help you answer that question specific to your brother are going to be other members of your family and your brother's support team. If he's in K-12 education, then his teachers, his team there with his IEP. If he is an adult, then if he has support services or ABA therapy, anything like that. And I imagine that it would actually be really awesome if your family knows that you want to help, and if he's working with a therapist, if the therapist knows, like, hey, this person has support. A lot of the time, when people are struggling with anything, just knowing that there are others who care and want to help can be really powerful. So I would start right there. Yeah, other questions? Let's see over here.
Hi, so my friend, she's an adult now. She's in a home where her mental illness isn't really taken very seriously, and I think I've talked about it with my mom and our friend group and trying to figure it out. So I would think she would be best in a a home with other people,
Like a group home?
Like a group home, exactly. And I was just wondering where I could get the resources or contacts, because I've heard that you have to do that years in advance, but I don't know how long the wait is. I don't know any. Do you know if you don't?
I can refer you to some resources of people who will be able to give you better answers. How about that?
I would love that. Thank you.
The Utah Parent Center, I know it says parent and not friend, but you can still contact them. They're awesome.
Yeah.
The Utah Parent Center has advocates who can help connect people with the right resources for them.
Okay.
Utah Valley University, they have a center called the Nelson Center for Autism, and they also are available to help with things like that. Housing is a huge issue for adults with autism in Utah, though.
Yeah.
There is not currently housing is a problem in Utah. There's not enough housing, just sort of writ large.
Yeah.
And then there's definitely not enough housing that is supportive for people with autism. The wait list that you mentioned,
Yeah.
that's part of the federal Medicaid waiver, and that's the wait list that currently has over 4,000 people on it.
Yeah.
So another thing you can do if you've got the stomach for it is get involved in the politics. Advocate to your legislators. Say, hey legislators, people that I care about are suffering because they don't have access to resources. Let's fix this. That's obviously a simplistic overview of what the legislative process is like. But if you care about it enough to dive in, it's amazing what people can do together.
Yeah, just those resources would
Yeah.
be good. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for the question.
For those of you who need to leave to go to your next class, you may be excused, but for those of you who'd like to stay and ask
Have a
more
good
questions,
class.
please come forward
Yeah,
to the.
I'll come down.
Can we please give her a round of applause?
Thank you.
so much.
Let's see, I can turn off my mic.